At the time of shooting this video, I think the Canon R7 has the worst IBIS on the market right now, and it certainly has the worst IBIS of any camera I have tested so far. I think this all can be resolved via firmware, but I've spent the past couple weeks working with Canon, going through the support desk, and I just can't get them to understand what the problem is and all the different issues with the IBIS. And part of it comes from the fact that the people on the support desk don't actually understand the camera very well. So this video is really as much for them as it is for sort of the Canon R7 buyers or owners out there right now. And the first thing I should say about IBIS in the R7 and sort of IBIS in general across any camera or camera system is that if you are using a lens with image stabilization in it, the lens actually does most of the image stabilization. In general, the IBIS will only take care of a couple different axes. Usually it's this one, and the lens is doing the rest. And when I test the kit lens, the 18-150 kit lens that I got with the R7, and I compare that sort of stability to using it on my R10, which has no IBIS, there's almost no difference whatsoever. So if you are using a lens with IS, you might not notice how bad the IBIS in the R7 is. And there's really two specific categories of lenses that are really not performing well with this IBIS system. The first one is using a old adapted lens, whether that be an EF or EFS lens that does have IBIS in the lens. What we're finding in a number of cases is that it appears that the IBIS in the camera body is actually fighting with the lens image stabilization. And at the end of this video, I will link a video where Michael Turner has sort of gone over his issues with lenses that appeared to work well on his old cameras, maybe 70D, 80D, 90D, something like that. But when he adapted them and put them on the R7, which Canon is saying this is a great stopgap until they have lenses for this camera, they're not working very well. In fact, those lenses worked better without an IBIS. They were better just using the lens IS without the IBIS. We have seen this in a few camera systems in the past, and effectively what I think is happening is the IS in the camera is actually fighting with the IS in the lens, and they're sort of not talking and working together. They're sort of working against each other. The other category lenses, and this is the one that I'm sort of concerned with today, is when you are using manual lenses on the Canon R7. And I see one of the very best uses of the Canon R7 is to put a cinema lens on the R7 and use the IBIS in the R7 to create that stability, and in a lot of situations eliminate the need for sort of a gimbal, monopod, tripod, what have you. So because the Canon R7 has that C-Log 3, I think this is a really, really cool setup and a really great way to use this camera. And I started a whole series about how to use these sort of cinema lenses on the Canon R7 and turn it into sort of a little cinema beast. And this can be an adapted lens, or it can be one of Canon's genuine lenses. But in speaking with Canon, they don't understand this sort of at all. They don't really understand how this is supposed to work. And when I first told them that I was using a third-party cinema lens, they were trying to blame the lens. But the lens is just an 85mm lens, and when you put any 85mm lens that is pure manual aperture, manual focus, and doesn't have any electronics, whether it be a Canon or other brand, in the menu system of the R7, you go in and specify what focal length the lens is. So I just go in, specify 85mm. That's what the IBIS system needs to know, so it knows how to move that sensor to stabilize the image with an 85mm lens. If you have an autofocus lens, it will report to the camera what the focal length is, so the camera knows what to do. But with any of these manual lenses, which you find all cinema lenses in general are manual lenses, you have to tell the camera what to do. And when I was testing this, I was finding that the IBIS just almost didn't seem to be working at all. So that made me sort of wonder, well, how good or bad is this IBIS, and why don't I compare it to my XT4? And just to be a fair comparison, I found two lenses that I have. These lenses, I've got an 85mm Astahori tilt lens, and I have that for both systems. So that way I could put it on my XT4, and I could also put it on my Canon R7, and I could compare the stability of the images. And what I found is the difference was absolutely night and day. And I'll just play a couple clips here. And you'll see that looking at the R7 with the stability and the settings right to 85mm to match up with these lenses, the image just isn't very stable. It's honestly terrible. And it almost looks like the IBIS isn't doing anything at all. And then you look at the XT4. XT4 has got the same story. You've got to go into the menu system, specify 85 millimeters, and the IBIS system in the Fuji actually has a couple of different options. So I just left it in the standard. There's like almost like a tripod mode that really locks it in, but I left it in the standard one just to be fair, which seems to be more similar to what the R7's standard mode is. And it's just not even close. It's just not even close. It made it clear that the R7 was not working the way that it was supposed to. Now, some of the shots that I had gotten out of the Canon R7, they were kind of close enough that I could stabilize them in editing, and that is what I did in the end. I also played with some of the digital image stabilization in the camera. But ultimately, when you do all these things, you do lose quality. And it really should not be necessary when you see the performance of the XT4. I mean, it's not even close. Really, the R7 should perform on that level, or at least very, very similarly. So following on from the 85 millimeter experiment, I decided to try 50 millimeters. So I went with a 50 millimeter manual focus, manual aperture lens, both on the Canon R7 and the XT4. And you can see the results. They were closer in this regard. The shorter focal length is automatically more stable, but you can still see that the XT4 was more stable than what the Canon R7 was, noticeably so, particularly when it came to sort of a little bit of drifting and those micro jitters that really wasn't taking those out with the Canon R7. Then I kind of thought to myself, is it just the process of telling the camera that it's an 85 millimeter lens or a 50 millimeter lens? What if I used an autofocus lens that doesn't have image stabilization? Would that actually sort of resolve the issue? Is it the fact that the menu system or the function where you're telling the camera what the focal length is that what is causing the problem? So I went back and I shot the 85 millimeter lens, and then I compared that to the EF 70-300 set to 85 millimeters. So now we've got both 85 millimeter focal lengths on the camera. One, I've gone into the menu system and specified to the camera that 85 millimeters is the focal length, and in the other one, the actual lens is telling the camera body that, and you can actually see that on the back of the camera. It will tell you what focal length you're at. So I just adjusted that until the camera said it's got 85 millimeters, and it says that on the screen. And what you'll see is a completely night and day difference. The image out of the autofocus lens was completely stable, even though, once again, that lens doesn't have image stabilization. The only thing that has really changed here is that the lens is telling the Canon R7 what the focal length is versus me specifying in the menu system what the focal length is. And following on from that, I then tried a 50 millimeter cinema lens, manual focus cinema lens, and I saw that that was more stable than the 85 millimeter, not nearly as bad, but you could still see some drifting and you could see some micro jitters in there. And then I compared that to the Canon EF 50 millimeter f1.8, the nifty 50. And once again, the results were very similar. We got sort of those micro jitters taken out, a lot more stability on the autofocus lens, even though essentially we are at the same focal length and they should be performing identical to each other because there's no image stabilization in either lens. What we're finding is if we go in and specify the focal length for these manual lenses, it just isn't working the way that it should be. I think all of this should be able to be fixed via firmware, but in my discussions with Canon, they just do not understand the issue. And one thing they keep saying to me is, oh, if it's a third-party lens, it's not going to work. We're telling everybody third-party lenses, they don't work on the camera. We don't support third-party lenses. Their support system is so obsessed with just telling people third-party lens is bad, they don't work, they don't support, that even when you're using a full manual lens that has no firmware, no contact, it does nothing to tell the camera anything. And the camera is designed to input the focal length so that you can get stability on any manual lens, whether it be a Canon lens, whether it be an adapted vintage lens, whether it be a Canon cinema lens. This is my Spectrum 7 Artisans 85 millimeter cinema lens. They all should work because 85 millimeters essentially is 85 millimeters, regardless of what system it comes from. But they're so obsessed with this third-party thing that they just aren't even paying attention to the fact that the IBIS in this camera is not working with any lenses of this type. Now, the other issue that we're seeing is with these adapted EF and EFS lenses, this sort of conflict and fighting and the idea that the video is actually less stable using it on an R7 with IBIS compared to using it on an old like 70D, 80D, 90D. I don't know how Canon is going to go about sort of sorting that out, but I would encourage people to test this for yourselves. And if you are finding the same experience, report it to Canon, because unless they're getting reports, they are not going to resolve this issue. And if you want some real world examples of how these adapted EFS lenses are not working very well, including that 10 to 18 millimeter EFS lens, which has been so popular with the 70D, 80D, 90D, I've just thrown a video on screen now, and Michael Turner covers this in some detail. And if you're thinking about adapting some of those old EF and EFS lenses, you really should watch this video.